2011, the Security Council set up a special committee to combat the terrorism of Al-Qaeda. The Security Council member states spent thousands of work hours to coordinate international efforts in considering how to confront the threats of this international terrorist organization. The question that comes to mind today is the following: how can the United Nations combat the terrorism of Al-Qaeda wearing one hat, while at the same time some of its member states are financing, providing succor, indeed sending combatants from Al-Qaeda to commit terrorist acts in Syria? Indeed, some of the statements by armed terrorist groups on their terrorist armed operations inside Syria came from the very territories of those Arab neighboring states. Perhaps you have heard the statement of the leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, where he called Al-Qaeda fighters from all parts of the world to go to Syria and commit terrorist acts. Perhaps you have heard statements by the leader of Al-Qaeda in Lebanon, Omar al-Bakri, who lived in Great Britain until 2005, when he was deported to Lebanon, when he expressed his intention to send Al-Qaeda elements across the borders to Syria for terrorist acts. These were reported in the media and didn't catch the attention of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, of the Security Council, or indeed a vast number of the members of this body. Perhaps you've also heard or read statements by officials in Lebanon and Iraq on the infiltration of some elements of Al-Qaeda into Syria coming from both Lebanon and Iraq. The Al-Qaeda website was even mourning 5 of its dead in Homs, Deir ez-Zor, on its website. Abu Hamza al-Muhajir al-Imarati, apparently from the UAE. Abu Sar al-Muhajir is another one, from another Arab state, Saudi Arabia. A third, a fourth, a fifth, whose corpses were discovered in Syria, whose identity was ascertained. 5 who came to commit terrorist acts in Syria. In addition, those whose bodies were found in Homs, 3 Al-Qaeda members from Libya. What is truly strange, ladies and gentlemen, is that the President of the General Assembly, who has made many official statements since his election to the presidency of the General Assembly, did not take up the suicide attacks in Damascus and Aleppo. He did not express his rejection of terrorist acts undertaken by Al-Qaeda in Syria, whereas he did hastily call for the convening of this meeting because, as he said, he wants to protect Syrian blood. Even worse, the resolution of the League of Arab States adopted yesterday in Cairo openly committed the League to providing material and political support to the Syrian opposition. Whereas we all know that some in the opposition have chosen to bear arms and are undertaking terrorist acts in Syria. This perforce means that whoever stands before this resolution taken in Cairo are now encouraging terrorism in Syria, running directly counter to Security Council Resolution of 1624 of 2005. This is incitement to terrorism, counter to the prohibition of the incitement to commit terrorist acts in that resolution. Ladies and gentlemen, the Gulf Cooperation Council states are part of the problem. They are not part of the solution. Let me refer to the fact that Al-Doha, the capital of Qatar, is now playing host to armed opposition groups that refuse national dialogue, that refuse implementation of the reform plan, that are fundamentally responsible for the shedding of Syrian blood. I am calling on the General Assembly, I am calling on the President of the General Assembly to shoulder your responsibilities in combating terrorism and to implement relevant resolutions in that regard. I also call on all those who host, support, fund, indeed arm terrorist groups to cease forthwith in accordance with the resolutions of international legitimacy. My country in this regard reaffirms its right to protect its citizens and to combat terrorism as well as armed violence and to put an end to them. We would have wished to see the same level of enthusiasm from the President of the General Assembly in calling for the convening of a meeting of the General Assembly to take up the membership drive of Palestine at these United Nations that may have brought the United States of America to accept that in the Security Council, to put pressure to bear on Israel, the occupying power, to put an end to its occupation of occupied Arab land, to put an end to settlement, and to allow for the creation of the State of Palestine. However, it's political hypocrisy by some, and it is short-sightedness and being co-opted by others. There are thousands of resolutions, dozens of investigating committees, fact-finding missions from this organization to put an end to Israel's occupation of Arab lands. None have been implemented. What has happened is that Israel and its protectors implemented half the partition resolution and simply conveniently forgot the other half, talking about the establishment of a Palestinian state in the land of Palestine.
Fighters in street clothes going head-to-head with a Libyan army tank. The amateur video purportedly shot last week, a dramatic glimpse of the war for Libya, pitting civilians against Gaddafi's heavily armed forces. Despite being severely outgunned, this is what rebel fighters did last month to the regime's military barracks in what is now the opposition capital of Benghazi. The destruction of the compound, the turning point in the fight for this key city. To many here, Al-Mehdi Ziu was the hero of that fight, a 49-year-old oil company worker, husband, father of two. The best way to help the opposition, he decided, was to sacrifice his life. His two teenage daughters say they had no idea what their father had planned. His wife, too distraught to...
Rebel fighters had surrounded it, and they were facing heavy firepower. They were trying to get inside these military barracks. They couldn't. They needed something to shift their momentum. What Al-Mehdi did was pack his car full of plastic car fuel containers in cooking gas cylinders. And witnesses say he parked his car right over there where that SUV is and prayed and read the Quran for about 30 minutes. And then he sped towards the main gate where he blew himself and his car up.
This is a picture of Al-Mehdi's best friend, Abdul Farhoud, carrying his remains after the blast.
If I didn't...
He did something very important. We're definitely very proud of him. Reza Sayah, CNN, Benghazi, Libya.
It's difficult to imagine the ferocity of the bombardments that engulfed the streets of Sirte. This is Area 2 on the western side, where Gaddafi loyalists fought to the bitter end. Now the victorious NTC fighters parade proudly through the empty streets, but there's no sense of liberation here. The Haddad family have lived through it all. Their house was caught in the crossfire. A rocket slammed through the roof of the living room. Over the past 4 decades, Sirte grew from a small fishing town to a bustling modern city. It came to symbolize Gaddafi's rule and his fall. It may yet also come to symbolize the country's renewal. Hud Abdelhamid, Al Jazeera, Sirte.
Government accused of abuse in the country's detention centers, it's been revealed that one former senior official could have fallen victim to torture by a militia. Libya's former ambassador to France has died in custody 24 hours after being detained by an armed group. For some insight on this, I'm joined by Sukant Shandon, Middle East expert and journalist, who joins us live from London. So human rights groups say the torture and killing of detainees is an ongoing problem in Libya. Do you think the militia responsible for it will be held to account?
I don't think the militia responsible for the likely torturing to death of Mr. Brabash will be held account. But there's a lot of, interesting political games going on in Libya. If you just step back and look at what's happening with this latest development, something interesting arises. Why is it that Mr. Brabash's killing has been fingered at the Zintani militia when we know that the permanent representative to the United Nations under the Gaddafi regime, that's Dr. Abouzeid Dorda, has been tortured by a militia in Tripoli, has been visited by the Red Crescent, and now is disappeared in the hands of another militia in Tripoli. So I've been looking through the Human Rights Watch website, I've been looking through the Amnesty website, and there's not one mention of Mr. Dorda. But here pops up the torturing of death to Mr. Brabesh. Now, what it seemed to me very clearly is that why this focus now on the Zintani militia is because the Zintani militia, the Zintani people are holding Saif al-Islam. And the West, especially the ICC, are very fearful about what the Zintani militia are going to do with Saif al-Islam. Saif al-Islam hasn't had access to a solicitor, as far as I know, and he hasn't said anything publicly. So I think for the Zintanis, that Saif al-Islam in their custody is the biggest power play that they've got to use in Libya. So I think this is the greater agenda of what's going on right now with this latest development. But nonetheless, Mr. Brabash does seem to have been tortured to death, who was the former ambassador to France.
All right, just for our viewers' information, Saif al-Islam being one of the surviving sons of Muammar Gaddafi, who is in custody. Now, Doctors Without Borders has recently suspended its mission in Misrata, saying it's treated patients for injuries sustained during interrogation. What do you make of that?
I think Doctors Without Frontiers, like Human Rights Watch, like Amnesty, they can't suddenly feign surprise about what's actually come to pass in Libya, because there's a pattern here emerging, isn't there? That so-called human rights organization, who obviously have a Western-centric, Eurocentric coloration on everything, they seem to provide the quote-unquote human rights justification for certain Western policies of foreign aggression. Then once these countries are destabilized and turned into failed states by the NATO or unilateral Western military aggression, then they suddenly are surprised that but they all along have been used and perhaps are allowing themselves to be used in actually in justifying a human rights so-called foreign intervention and then feigning surprise. But I think it's interesting what they've said, and it's quite clear what's going on, is that Doctors Without Borders have said very clearly that we are being used by the Libyan rebels to basically make better those detainees that have been tortured so they can be tortured again. So the torture state which Libya has now developed, which just with Gaddafi's regime pales into was a much better human rights situation by any real standards. Now, Doctors Against Borders are feigning surprise, but frankly, they are being used in this way and they're allowing themselves to be used. And it's high time, really, that the people across the world see these so-called human rights organizations for what they are. Basically the Trojan horses of Western foreign policy.
All right, one last question I want to toss in here. We only have a